In 1565, the Spanish colonial government made an official declaration. The Taino, the people who had greeted Columbus on the beach, were extinct, gone, wiped out by disease, slavery, and colonial violence in barely 70 years. One of the fastest genocides in recorded history. Or so the textbook said. The colonial census recorded it. The history books repeated it. For 450 years, the Taino existed only in the past tense. But in 2018, geneticists extracted DNA from a 1,000-year-old Taino tooth and found that the people the Spanish declared extinct were still very much alive. The tooth came from a cave burial site on the island of Eleuthera in the Bahamas. A woman who lived approximately 1,000 years ago, centuries before European contact. When the researchers compared her genome to living Caribbean populations, the match was unmistakable. Modern Puerto Ricans carry between 10 and 15% indigenous ancestry, and it matches the ancient Taino genome directly. The study, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences by Hannes Schroeder and colleagues, was the first to sequence an ancient Taino genome. The Taino weren't a small, isolated tribe. Before Columbus, they were the dominant civilization of the Caribbean, an estimated 3 million people spread across Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Jamaica, Cuba, and the Bahamas. They built elaborate villages. They developed sophisticated agriculture, growing cassava, maize, and tobacco. They carved intricate ceremonial objects. They played a ball game on stone courts that still stand today. At Caguana, in the mountains of Puerto Rico, 10 stone-lined ball courts survive, the largest complex of its kind in the Caribbean. The Taino called the game Beatty, and it held religious and political significance. Their villages were organized around a central plaza led by a cacique, a chief whose authority was hereditary. The social structure was complex, with distinct classes of nobles, commoners, and a priestly caste called Behiques. And then Columbus arrived. October 12, 1492, the Taino paddled out in canoes to greet the ships. Within decades, their world collapsed. Smallpox arrived first, then measles, then influenza. Diseases the Taino had never encountered swept through populations with no immunity. Estimates suggest 50 to 90% mortality from disease alone within the first 50 years. The Spanish encomienda system followed. Taino communities were forced into labor on plantations and in gold mines. Those who resisted were killed. Those who fled into the mountains were hunted. By 1530, the colonial administration was already importing enslaved Africans to replace the rapidly dying Taino workforce. By 1565, the Spanish declared the indigenous population effectively gone, but declared extinct, and actually extinct are not the same thing. And the DNA proves it. Mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively from mother to child, tells the story of the Taino women who survived. In modern Puerto Rico, roughly 61% of mitochondrial lineages are indigenous American. 61%, not 10, not 15. The majority of Puerto Rican maternal lineages trace back to indigenous Caribbean women the colonial records said no longer existed. The pattern repeats across the Caribbean, in the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Indigenous mitochondrial DNA is carried by millions of people who were taught their ancestors were extinct. The pattern holds across every island. In the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, millions carry indigenous DNA the colonial record declared extinct. The colonial declaration was wrong. The Taino weren't destroyed. They were absorbed in a mixed population that the Spanish called mestizo, but that genetics now reveals was far more indigenous than anyone assumed. The autosomal DNA, the full genome, not just maternal or paternal lines, shows modern Puerto Ricans carry roughly 10 to 15% indigenous ancestry on average. Some individuals carry significantly more. Carlos Bustamante's team at Stanford analyzed thousands of Puerto Rican genomes and found that the indigenous component wasn't random noise. It was a coherent signal matching the ancient Taino genome precisely. The chromosomal segments don't lie. Specific stretches of DNA in living Puerto Ricans are identical to sequences from the 1,000-year-old Taino burial. The ancient genome lives on, fragmented but present in millions of people. In the streets of Old San Juan, built on the bones of a Taino settlement called Capara, modern Puerto Ricans walk over the ground where their indigenous ancestors lived. But here is the twist. The survival wasn't equal across the genome. The mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, survived at far higher rates than the Y chromosome. The paternal line, indigenous maternal lineages, 61%. Indigenous paternal lineages, less than 5%. The Taino mothers survived. The Taino fathers largely did not. The genetic signature is unmistakable and uncomfortable. Spanish men, colonists, soldiers, administrators, fathered children with Taino women. The children carried their mother's mitochondrial DNA and their father's Y chromosomes over generations. The indigenous paternal lineage was replaced, while the maternal lineage endured. This is the genetic record of colonialism itself, written not in documents but in chromosomes. The mothers survived. The fathers were erased. The same asymmetry appears everywhere colonialism imposed itself. In Mexico, Peru, the Philippines, Australia, indigenous maternal lineages persist at high frequencies, while paternal lineages were replaced by the colonizers. The genome records the power dynamics that history textbooks often sanitize. But the Taino didn't just survive genetically, they survived culturally. The English words hammock, hurricane, barbecue, canoe, and tobacco all come from the Taino language. They're used daily by billions of people who have no idea they're speaking Taino. Cassava preparation in the Caribbean still follows techniques the Taino developed 1,000 years ago. The grater board, the woven press to extract cyanide, the flat griddle for baking. The recipe survived because the women who knew it survived. The crops the Taino cultivated, cassava, sweet potato, peanut, pineapple, guava, are still staples across the Caribbean. The agricultural knowledge was passed down through the same maternal lines that carried the mitochondrial DNA. In the caves of Puerto Rico and Hispaniola, Taino petroglyphs survive, carved faces, spirals, and figures that predate Columbus by centuries. The people who carved them were supposed to be gone. Their DNA says otherwise. The deeper investigation reaches beyond Puerto Rico, into what the ancient Taino genome reveals about where the Caribbean's first people came from and how they colonized the islands. The ancient genome confirmed what archaeologists had long suspected. The Taino descended from Arawak-speaking peoples who migrated northward through the Lesser Antilles from the Orinoco River basin in what is now Venezuela. The Orinoco, one of the great rivers of South America, was the launching point. From its delta, island-hopping canoe voyagers moved north through Grenada, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and eventually reached Puerto Rico and Hispaniola. Each island was a stepping stone. The journey from the Orinoco to Puerto Rico, roughly 2,000 kilometers, took centuries. Communities established themselves on each island before some pushed further north. The ancient Taino genome confirmed this route. The closest living genetic relatives of the pre-contact Taino are Arawak, speaking peoples in the Amazon and Orinoco basins, populations that still live in Venezuela, Guyana, and Brazil. The genetic diversity tells the story of the journey. Each island hop reduced the gene pool slightly, a serial founder effect. By the time the Taino reached Puerto Rico, their genome was less diverse than their mainland cousins, but still distinctly South American. A 2020 follow-up study by Fernandez and colleagues sequenced ancient genomes from across the Caribbean, providing the most complete picture of pre-contact island genetics ever assembled. The expanded dataset revealed that pre-contact Caribbean populations weren't genetically uniform. Different islands showed distinct genetic profiles, but all traced back to the same South American source. Shell middens, ancient garbage dumps, line the Caribbean coastline. Each one contains the remains of meals eaten by Taino ancestors, and increasingly, each one contains the bones that yield ancient DNA. Since the DNA studies, a cultural revival has accelerated. Communities across the Caribbean and in the diaspora, particularly in New York, have embraced Taino identity with new scientific backing. In Puerto Rico, the Taino revival movement has grown from a handful of families to thousands of people who identify as Taino descendants, learning the language, practicing traditional agriculture, and reclaiming an identity that colonialism tried to erase. But the revival raises a question the DNA can't answer by itself. At what point does genetic ancestry become cultural identity? If you carry 15% Taino DNA but grew up speaking Spanish and practicing Catholicism, are you Taino? The question has no clean answer. Some argue that genetic ancestry alone is sufficient, that carrying Taino DNA makes you Taino whether you practice the culture or not. Others insist that identity requires active cultural engagement. The U.S. Census recorded 0 indigenous people in Puerto Rico for decades. After the DNA studies, thousands began self-identifying. The genome gave people permission to claim what the colonial record had taken away. In families across the island, grandmothers had always known the straight black hair, the copper skin, the knowledge of medicinal plants, the food preparation techniques. These weren't just customs. They were inheritance. Specific physical traits linked to indigenous ancestry, shovel-shaped incisors, particular hair textures, certain skin pigmentation patterns remain common in Puerto Rico. The genome shaped the body, and the body carried the evidence. Across the Caribbean, archaeologists are finding new pre-contact sites every year. Each one provides bones, teeth, and pottery that can yield ancient DNA, expanding the genetic picture island by island. The geographic coverage is growing. Ancient genomes have now been recovered from the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, Cuba, Curacao, and several Lesser Antilles islands. Each genome adds resolution. The Taino created elaborate spiritual objects called zemis, carved figures representing ancestral spirits. These objects survived in museum collections, and some have been tested for residue DNA from the hands that carved them. The spiritual world of the Taino didn't die with a colonial declaration. Elements of Taino belief merged with Catholicism and African spiritual traditions to create something new, a syncretic religious landscape that still shapes Caribbean culture. In the Dominican Republic, folk spiritual practices still invoke Taino imagery. The indigenous layer isn't visible on the surface, but it is there, woven into the fabric of Caribbean spirituality. In the Dominican Republic, indigenous ancestry follows the same mountain refuge pattern as Puerto Rico. The rural Cibao Valley, the agricultural heartland, shows higher indigenous percentages than the coastal port cities. In Cuba, the pattern repeats again. Eastern Cuba, the most mountainous and remote region, preserves the highest indigenous ancestry. Baracoa, where Columbus first landed, still carries traces of the people he met. Geography shaped survival. Mountains offered refuge. Isolation preserved ancestry. Across every Caribbean island, the same geographic logic applies. The harder the land was to reach, the more indigenous DNA it preserved. 3 islands, 3 colonial histories. 1 genetic pattern. The mountains saved what the ports destroyed. In 2018, the same year as the Schroeder study, a comprehensive survey identified over 35,000 Puerto Ricans who self-identified as having indigenous ancestry. The DNA studies gave language to something families had known for generations. The political implications are real. Indigenous recognition could affect land rights, cultural heritage protections, and the way Caribbean history is taught in schools. The DNA study wasn't just science, it was leverage. Textbooks are already changing. The narrative of total Taino extinction is being replaced, slowly, with a more accurate story of survival through admixture. A generation of Caribbean students will grow up knowing what the DNA proved. Their ancestors didn't vanish, they adapted. They mixed, they survived. The story isn't just about Taino survival, it is about African survival too. enslaved Africans brought to the Caribbean mixed with surviving indigenous populations, creating the richly complex genomes that modern Caribbean people carry today. No two Caribbean genomes are exactly alike. The admixture proportions vary from person to person, family to family, village to village. But the indigenous component is there in virtually everyone, a shared inheritance from the Taino mothers who survived. The faces in a Caribbean market tell the whole story: European features, African features, indigenous features, often all three in the same face. The genome made visible. Natural selection also played a role. Specific indigenous genetic variants, particularly immune system, genes adapted to tropical pathogens, were preserved at higher rates because they provided survival advantages. The Taino genome wasn't just carried passively, it was actively selected for. 1,000 years separate the ancient Taino woman from the cave in the Bahamas and the modern grandmother in the Cordillera Central pressing cassava through a woven sieve. The technique is identical. The mitochondrial DNA may be too. The hands that prepare the food carry the same genetic material as the hands that invented the recipe. 1,000 years, an ocean of colonial violence, and the connection survived in both the genome and the kitchen. The Spanish declared the Taino extinct because it served colonial purposes. A people declared extinct can't claim land, can't demand rights, can't challenge the narrative that the Caribbean was empty and waiting. In the mountains of Puerto Rico's interior, the Cordillera Central, communities with the highest indigenous ancestry proportions have lived continuously since before Columbus. They never left. They were simply reclassified. The geographic pattern makes sense. The mountains offered refuge. Spanish colonial control was concentrated on the coasts, in the ports and plantations. The interior communities preserved more indigenous ancestry because they had more distance from the colonial centers. In these mountain villages, families kept traditions alive, not as conscious cultural preservation, but as everyday life. The way to prepare cassava, the names for local plants. The stories passed from grandmother to granddaughter. The Taino aren't alone. Across the colonial world, populations declared extinct are being found genetically in their descendants. The colonial record declared them gone. The genome says they adapted, mixed, and endured. Puerto Rican geneticists are now leading their own studies, reclaiming the scientific narrative about their own ancestry. The days of outsiders defining Caribbean identity are ending. The indigenous ancestry has medical implications too. Specific genetic variants from Taino ancestors affect how modern Puerto Ricans metabolize certain drugs, their susceptibility to specific diseases, and their immune responses. The genome doesn't just record history, it shapes health. 3 findings. The Taino were declared extinct. Their DNA survives in millions. The colonial declaration was a political act, not a biological fact. The Taino didn't disappear. They became Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, Cubans. Their genome blended with European and African DNA to create the Caribbean populations of today. The extinction was a myth. The survival is molecular fact. How many other colonial extinction declarations will the genome overturn? The Taino are the proof of concept. The DNA doesn't forget what empires tried to erase. 450 years of official extinction, overturned by a single tooth from a cave in the Bahamas. The Taino were here before Columbus, and they're still here. The women survived, the mothers survived, and through them, through their mitochondrial DNA, through their cassava recipes, through their words for hurricane and hammock and canoe, the Taino survived. The Taino walked out of South America, across the island chain, and into the Caribbean. Columbus walked onto the same beaches 1,400 years later. The colonial record erased one set of footprints. The genome preserved them. Today, Taino DNA doesn't just live in the Caribbean. The Puerto Rican diaspora, over 5 million people in the continental United States, carries the same indigenous ancestry. From the Bronx to Orlando to Chicago, the Taino genome travels. More people carry Taino DNA today than the total Taino population before Columbus arrived. 3 million then. 10 million carriers now. The declared extinction produced more descendants, not fewer. Every commercial DNA test taken by a Puerto Rican, a Dominican, or a Cuban reveals the same thing. The indigenous component appears. The Taino appear. 450 years after being declared extinct. How many other colonial extinction declarations will the genome overturn? The Taino are the proof of concept. The DNA doesn't forget what empires tried to erase. 450 years of official extinction, overturned by a single tooth from a cave in the Bahamas. The women survived, the mothers survived, and through them, through their DNA, their cassava recipes, their words for hurricane and hammock and canoe, the Taino survived. One tooth, one cave, one woman who lived 1,000 years ago, and a genetic legacy that 4 centuries of colonialism could not destroy. Subscribe if you want to follow the evidence wherever it leads. Sources for everything in this video are linked in the description below.